Michelle was the light of my life. I still see her smile sometimes when I close my eyes between these oppressive walls. The rank smell of sweat and piss do not filter into that beautiful place where my sister is. I try to smile back at her sometimes, but I cannot. My world has gone bleak since she was taken from me, and even laughter was too bright a light to filter into my soul. It had been us, Michelle and I, against the world since our parents had passed. She was the calmest soul anyone could meet, and she did not trouble anyone. Yet that foul bastard had run the red light, crushing Michelle against the wall so badly that I could not recognize the only family I had in the world. Driving under the influence. He was drunk, hit and run, unintentional manslaughter. All those many words that did not serve Michelle or I the justice that we truly deserved. I could not forgive it. I could not forgive myself either. Not when he got a lenient sentence that saw him out of jail in a matter of years, while I got to live in the horror of that dreadful night, seething with rage and sorrow. The emptiness yawned at me and overwhelmed me every time it did, until I knew I had to do something about it. I took a job at the construction site near the Dunkin' Donuts where I knew he would eat sometimes, and I staked it every evening with the hope that one day I would meet him and still be angry enough to feed him the same pain he had at my feast. My routine was simple after my shift at the site. 3 plain donuts, 3 pies, and 1 extra-large Sprite soda. I turned to nursing my coffee and donuts after a long day as a plumber at the site, sitting in the punishing silence as other people would come in and leave, and no sign of the drunk driver. On some days, I was hardly noticed, as a threat. The staff, regarding me as a new regular that worked at the construction firm, did their best to not draw attention to me while I ate, and I appreciated it for all of the 3 weeks that I staked there. On some other days, the staff would be chatty, cautious of my presence, sitting in the corner and throwing humor about it as though to get me into a lighter mood. I appreciated it, but I was in so much pain that Dunkin' Donuts entertainment and food was not enough color for me. The evening my stalking paid off, the weather was particularly gloomy and cold, as though the elements mourned my actions. The weight of unfulfilled vengeance hung on my shoulders as I grabbed a slice of my donut in a mouthful. My eyes had drifted to the door, as it always did, scanning for his presence, and I had not expected him to stagger into the cafe as he did, and I must confess that my heart did skip a beat. He was in the company of friends, obviously drunk, and maintained that brash demeanor that riled me up so badly, causing the donut in my mouth to immediately go dry. I sat there in terrific rage, watching him burst into hearty conversation with his friends that he came in with. I wondered how he could continue to live his life lacking so much remorse for my sister's life, which he had taken from me. My fingers trembled as I watched him, numbed the rest of the occurrences around. I simply knew he was being loud, and security pulled him aside, helping him up from the ground as he stumbled, and they held him outside. His friends promised to get what they needed, and all he had to do was wait for them in the car. My heart pounded in my chest, and my vision narrowed to him as he turned around with a slow march to the car. I could not let such a moment pass me by without doing something about it. I jumped on my feet and walked briskly after him to go where the cars were parked. I bumbled in my stride, but I tried to maintain some composure, even in my anger. "Jerry!" I called him once I was within earshot. He turned around and stared at me briefly, determining that I was not worth his time. He continued to walk away. I called him again. "What, pal? Who the hell are you?" He belched, the stench of alcohol covering the distance between us. You're Jerry?" My voice broke. I saw his eyes dance as he tried to search for my face in his mind. "I don't got no time for games. I'm going home." With that, he flicked his key out of his pocket. Grief blinded me, and I could not let what he had done to Michelle happen to someone else. "You won't take another life," I said to him, and immediately I drew out a pocket knife that I always kept on me. Jerry turned around, and the look of horror that flashed across his face was like one who had seen the devil himself. He opened his mouth to speak, but his words had barely formed in his mouth when I jabbed my blade into his gut, dragging it across his belly. He grabbed my shirt tightly and rasped in desperate terror, needing to shake me off as he bled. "Please, don't kill me. I'm no killer," he cried, sober from his alcohol when he was faced with the present manifestation of death. I knew I could not stop, even though I was just as scared and confused as him. I pulled the blade out and stabbed him in the chest 3 times, puncturing his heart. "There's only one killer between us," I said to him, the terror in his eyes affecting me. "Mother," he cussed at me. "Michelle! Remember her?" I said. And immediately I saw him reconcile with his dying breath that he indeed deserved his fate. "I'm sorry. Please, save me," he clucked, choking. Apologies and pleas felt like salt on an open wound. It filled me with an intense annoyance of him because Michelle never got to beg for her life when he ended her life. His eyes were in so much despair for his fate. None of his bravado and arrogance remained. His hands trembled until they suddenly went stiff. It was only then that I moved on from him, realizing what I had done. I was crippled with the dread of such an irrevocable horror that came with a twisted sense of closure. It was final. I had done it for Michelle, and my sister could now rest easy knowing I had given her justice at the cost of my own freedom. I made no attempt to flee, and I just sat beside the body as the sirens approached. I was handcuffed, and I've been incarcerated for that one horrifying night of release. I accept my fate with calm resignation.
Would appreciate if you could hit the like button before moving on to the next story.
Tabby was my best friend in high school. We were like sisters. But then we graduated. I stayed in my hometown and went to the community college here, while Tabby joined the Peace Corps and spent 5 years in East Africa. When she left, I was so excited for her. I knew she'd have these wild stories to tell me during our Zoom calls. We planned to talk at least once a week. Unfortunately, her village in Tanzania didn't have any Wi-Fi. I'd send her emails, hoping that she'd respond during her monthly trips into the city, and at first she did, but over time, it was just too hard to reach her. I'd lost my best friend. Then, after nearly 5 years of silence, Tabby sent me a message that she was back in town and wanted to see me. I can't tell you how excited I was. We met the next day for lunch. She invited me over to her house, which was the same place where she'd grown up. Her parents had just moved away, so I guess they gave it to her. When she opened the door to greet me, I was shocked by how much she looked the same. Everything about her, from her hairstyle to her clothes, hadn't changed since high school. She still looked like she was a teenager. Meanwhile, I'd changed a lot. I think I look pretty good, but I'm definitely not the same woman I was at 17. Tabby excitedly pulled me inside. Her living room was completely packed with all kinds of boxes and tiny wooden crafts that covered every shelf and table. Clearly, she needed time to unpack. "Sorry about the mess," she said, and led me through the piles of boxes so we could sit on the couch. She excitedly explained that she'd met someone in Tanzania. His name was Jacob. Not only were they engaged, but they'd gone into business together. All these wooden crafts in her house were authentic pieces of Tanzanian art that Jacob made himself. She gushed over how talented he was and how much they loved each other. Their plan was to create an online craft shop where Jacob handled the crafts and Tabby handled all the business stuff. They seemed really committed to each other. I looked down at the wooden figurines and bowls on the coffee table in front of me. I was about to compliment them until I recognized one of the bowls. I'd seen the exact same thing somewhere. I couldn't remember if it was at World Market or Pier 1 or something, but it was definitely at some store. Curious, I picked up the bowl to look closer. Sure enough, I saw a faded circle on the bottom where it had a price sticker. This was fake. Maybe they all were. I instantly worried that Tabby's new business partner was lying to her. Jacob made all these himself? I asked. Every single one, she said. I felt my heart sink. She had no idea. Who knew how much money she'd already put into this business? I hoped it wasn't too much. I was about to tell her that the crafts were fake, but then the front door opened and her fiancé came back. Jacob was a tall African man with an almost British-sounding accent. He stuck out his hand and introduced himself. I could tell right away how he could have duped Tabby the way he did. He was confident and very hot. Jacob sat with us and joined the conversation. He kept rubbing Tabby's shoulder and kissing her cheek while he explained his love of woodwork. Tabby, who must have heard all his stories before, acted like she was hanging on every word. It was a pleasant conversation, but all I could think about was how Jacob had tricked her. I needed to say something, but I couldn't find an opening. Plus, it was such an awkward thing to bring up in front of him. Eventually, Tabby left for the bathroom. Now that Jacob and I were alone, I figured I could just level with him. I knew it would be better for Tabby to hear about the scam from him directly. So I point-blank told him that his crafts were fake. His smile faded. You don't trust me? No, I said. You want me to stay away from Tabby, don't you? He asked. Yes, I answered right as Tabby re-entered the room. Jacob had seen her coming, but I hadn't. Tabby looked at me like I had just slapped her. From her point of view, it must have seemed like I was the jealous friend trying to scare off her fiancé. She told me to leave. I tried to explain what happened, but she refused to listen. She basically shoved me out the door. I knew I should have given her some space and let her figure things out on her own, but I just couldn't. Every day she was probably wasting more and more of her money while Jacob bought cheap garbage and passed it off as original stuff. The longer she stuck with her doomed business, the worse off she'd be. I had to do something. I got in my car and drove around the corner so they'd think I left. Then I snuck back into their yard, just to keep watch. I had a feeling I might be able to get some photo evidence of Jacob's scam. That would be the best way to force her to realize the truth. I waited in the bushes for a while, but all I saw was the two of them eating lunch together. I would have eaten with them if Tabby hadn't kicked me out. Obviously, I didn't get any evidence then, but after they were finished, Tabby did the dishes while Jacob went into the other room to unbox a bunch of store-bought garbage and peel off all the packaging and stickers. This was my proof. I took a bunch of photos, but I had to leave very quickly once it seemed that Jacob caught a glimpse of me through the window. I wasn't 100% sure that he had seen me, but I didn't want to risk it. I went back home and texted the damning photos to Tabby. She didn't respond. The little check marks in the corner showed that she didn't even open my messages. That didn't stop me, though. I went online and found out everything I could about Jacob. Apparently, he had a criminal record back in Tanzania for stealing and embezzlement. It looked like he had a really long history of scamming people. For the next few days, I drove by Tabby's house a lot. I needed to talk to her alone, but she and Jacob were always together. Then one afternoon, I finally got my chance. I saw that their car wasn't in the driveway and Tabby was all alone in the kitchen. I quickly parked and rushed to the front door. I kept knocking until she let me in. This time, there were even more boxes in the house. If anything, their business was expanding. Tabby was absolutely pissed to see me. I knew I didn't have much time before she kicked me out again, so thankfully, I brought some visual aids. I picked up some identical wooden bowls from the shop and showed her how they were identical to Jacob's supposed crafts. It was ironclad proof. Tabby took a deep breath and said, I know. Slowly, she explained that she and Jacob were scammers together. They always had been. They'd met her first week in Africa. He convinced her to quit the Peace Corps and team up with him. They'd swindled one too many people back in Tanzania and decided to try their luck in America. This didn't sound like Tabby at all. When she left for Africa, she was full of excitement and ideals. She wanted to change the world, not rip it off. Why? I asked her. To answer me, she pulled out her phone and opened her banking app. I'd never seen so many digits. She was filthy rich now. And that's after buying this house for my parents, she bragged. How could you make that much money? I asked, assuming that they must have been involved in darker stuff too. Because we work hard, she said, and we don't let anyone get in the way. She stepped closer, her eyes dead serious. Someone grabbed my shoulder. I spun around to see Jacob looming behind me. He must have come in while Tabby was talking. His eyes were narrowed. You're not gonna get in our way, are you? They glared at me from both sides. I felt trapped. If these two were capable of stealing that much money, who knew what they'd do to me? I started to panic. No one knew I was here. If I disappeared, no one would be able to trace it back to them. I'd be a missing person forever. I was trembling. I had no idea what to do, so I eventually put up my hands and said, "Your secret's safe with me." To my total shock, they both wrapped me in a big hug. So now I'm roped into their scam too. I'm in charge of scratching up the products to make them look more authentic. I feel terrible about it, but I've already made $6,000.
Would appreciate if you could hit the like button before moving on to the next story.
I moved to Utah for work. I rented a cozy little house in a nice neighborhood. Everything seemed perfect on the surface. But after a few days, I started to get the sense that my neighbors didn't like me. They all kept their distance, and whenever I saw them on the street, they seemed weirdly nervous. It was October, so of course I decorated my house for Halloween. It was my favorite holiday, and I brought a bunch of fun retro decorations with me. I thought that if I went all out with my decorations, I'd give my neighbors a reason to come over and talk to me. It was like a conversation starter. Unfortunately, the exact opposite happened. People avoided me even more than usual. In fact, the only person who ever talked to me was my next-door neighbor, Frank, a retired widower who looked particularly cranky. He walked into my front yard as I was setting out all my jack-o'-lanterns and told me to take everything down.
You really shouldn't decorate in our neighborhood, especially for Halloween.
He sounded pretty threatening, but I told him that this was my house and I could decorate it as I wanted. The neighborhood didn't have an HOA or anything, and my rental agreement didn't say anything about holiday decorations. When it was clear that I wasn't going to back down, he left. For the next week or so, I felt more and more like an outcast in my own home. I liked my new job, and I liked the house itself, but I felt so uncomfortable in the neighborhood. The air itself felt tense and uninviting. Then, one morning, I found a slip of paper under my front door. It was an invitation for a Halloween party for everyone in the neighborhood. Halloween was still a few days away, but the party was scheduled for that night. It gave an address from a few streets over, as well as a 6 o'clock starting time. The only other information was a message to wear a family-friendly costume. I was so happy to be included. I didn't want to rock the boat any more than I already had, so I bought an angel costume at Walmart. I wanted to wear something more fun, like an undead cheerleader outfit or something, but I thought that an angel would be less likely to offend my obviously more religious neighbors. I arrived at the address exactly at 6, but the house was empty. There were no cars nearby, and the lights were all off. Worse, there was a for sale sign in the front. And that's when I knew that someone was pranking me. I hate to admit it, but I started to cry. I sat on the empty doorstep, sadness washing over me. I should never have come here. I didn't belong. It took a while to calm myself down. Then I got back in my car and drove home. I was so upset that I didn't realize that my front door was wide open until I stepped onto my porch. Someone had broken into my house while I was gone. Whoever had given me the fake invitation must have used it as a way to get me out of the house. My entire living room was trashed. All my Halloween decorations were broken. And worst of all, someone had smeared "Go home" on my wall. Judging by the texture and smell, they'd written the message in feces. I backed out of my house in disbelief. No one had ever been this cruel to me before. Suddenly, someone appeared at my side. It was my neighbor, Frank, asking if I was okay. His face looked concerned, but I knew that was an act. "Why do you hate me so much?" I asked him. My voice came out high-pitched and whiny, but I didn't care. He nervously looked around the empty street, and he asked if we could talk in private. He wanted me to go into his house. "No!" I shouted. "Go away!" He started to respond, but he stopped himself. He could see how angry I was. I stared him down until he retreated back into his house. I waited on my porch for a while, trying to figure out what to do. My whole house reeked of manure. I didn't want to go back inside. But if I didn't clean up soon, the smell would soak into the walls. I hated living here. I hated Frank for doing this to me, and I hated all my other neighbors for letting it happen. Before I knew it, the old lady from across the street walked toward me. "You okay?" she asked gently. I'd seen her before, but always from a distance. She looked a lot like my own grandmother. She helped me to my feet and asked me if I'd like to go to her house and talk about it. Finally, a moment of kindness. I followed her across the street, feeling some of my anger fade away. She brought me inside and she started fixing us some tea. Her house was immaculate. There wasn't a speck of dust anywhere. I could tell from her framed pictures that she was a religious woman. She said her name was Sally, and she'd seen Frank sneak out of my house just moments before I got back. She apologized for his actions, adding that Frank had already scared off at least 5 other neighbors in the last few years. "And you let him get away with it?" I asked. I pulled out my phone, ready to call the police and report him. Sally stopped me.
"You can't," she said. "Frank has connections with the police. They're not going to believe you. In fact, they'll probably blame you."
She handed me a cup of tea. I genuinely hate tea, so I only pretended to drink. I didn't want to be rude. "I'm still going to call the police anyway."
"Don't," she insisted. "It's hopeless. Once Frank decides that he disapproves of someone, he won't stop until they move away. That's probably your best option."
Deep down, I knew she was right. I couldn't live next door to someone so heartless.
"I hate to say this," Sally continued, "but you should probably just go home, like he wrote on the wall."
I slowly realized something. "How did you know what he wrote? Did you go inside my house?" Panic flashed across her face. She knew she'd been caught in a lie. "You did it," I said. "Frank had warned me not to put up the decorations because he knew that you were a psycho, right? Right?" Sally took a deep breath. "You caught me," she said. "But it's too late for you to do anything about it. Feeling sleepy?" I knew in that moment that she had put sleeping pills in my tea. Thank God I didn't drink any of it. "Why are you doing this?" I asked. She rose from her chair and stood over me, beaming from ear to ear. "Because we don't need you here." She casually explained that her cousin was my landlord, the guy I was renting my new house from. All she has to do is tell him that I trashed my own house, and he'd believe her. He'd kick me out, just like all the other heathens who tried to enter her neighborhood. Well, she wouldn't have told me all this if she'd known that I wasn't drugged. I gripped the teacup really tightly, and as she leaned closer, I splashed the hot liquid into her face. Then I jumped up and raced out of her house. When I opened the door, Frank was standing just outside. He was waiting for me, his face full of concern. "I'm so sorry I didn't listen to you. I said, as Sally whimpered in pain behind me. I noticed that he held buckets of wet manure in each hand. He must have gotten them from Sally's backyard, the same manure she had used to deface my house. I wasn't sure why he'd brought those buckets to the front door. They were evidence against Sally, so he shouldn't have touched them. But then, he handed one of the buckets to me and said, "Her reign of terror ends tonight." Sally was on the floor now, furiously wiping at her burned eyes. We both walked back in with the manure. He took his bucket and he splashed it around the room, making sure to soak Sally with it. I followed his lead. We coated her spotless living room with feces, finally turning the tables on her. Then, Frank left without saying anything. I did too. When we got back to my house, Frank helped me clean up all the wreckage. A couple other neighbors joined us. I'd never met them before, but they'd all had their own run-ins with Sally in the past. That night, I finally made some friends. I never saw Sally again. She moved away after that. I guess she was afraid to show her face in the community anymore. And as soon as she was gone, more Halloween decorations came up all around the neighborhood. Without Sally's influence, we were all free to celebrate the holiday in peace. Back in college, I worked at a 24-hour diner. It was a cute little place right next to my dorm building. Our customers were entirely college students, which meant that the diner got a bit crazy during mealtimes. That's why I always preferred to work the night shift. Night customers were always drunk or high, but there were never any lines. It was a chill job. It really was. Then, one night, my coworker, Libby, called in sick at the last minute. She'd covered for one of my shifts a week before, so it was time to return the favor. Without her, I had to man the kitchen and serve the customers at the same time. Thankfully, our nighttime menu was mostly pre-cooked meals, so all I had to do was warm things up. I could handle it no problem. For the first 3 hours of my shift, I had a handful of customers, all coming alone. 2 had the munchies, and 1 was in the middle of an all-nighter, typical nighttime customers. Then someone else came into the diner, a stranger. I'd never met him before. He was about 50 with a pointed goatee. Our school had a few older students, but I knew them all. This guy did not go to our school. He walked up to the counter and ordered chicken fingers and fries. His voice was weirdly intense. I took his money and heated up his food, but when I turned back around to face him, I saw that he was staring straight at me. He seemed nervous. "You're Bonnie, right?" How did he know that? I didn't have my name tag on. As I handed him his food, he started asking me personal questions. About my classes, about my mom, about my future plans. He seemed to know a lot about me, but I didn't know anything about him. I answered him politely, but concisely. I tried not to give away too much information about myself. After he asked me about my GPA, I'd had enough. "Who are you?" He took a deep breath, psyching himself up. Then he said, "Bonnie, I'm Wilson, your biological father." I was too shocked to speak. "I've been blocked from seeing you ever," he explained, "but I couldn't stop myself. I had to come here and meet you." I'd never known my father. My mom always said he was a one-night stand. She didn't even remember his name. And I'd always believed her. But this man did look a bit like me, and he seemed to be the right age. I didn't trust him yet, but I was intrigued. Another customer walked in, a freshman I recognized from one of my econ classes. I didn't know his name, but he seemed like a nice, slightly nerdy guy. He glanced suspiciously at my alleged father as he approached the counter. While he waited for me to take his order, Wilson slid a slip of paper into my hand. His address was written in big, scratchy letters. "Visit me after your shift and I'll explain everything." He paused for a second before adding, "Please." "Okay," I said. I was beyond excited. All my life I'd wanted to know who my real father was. I never realized how much it ate at me until that moment. I got the other customers' food ready while my dad ate alone. By the time I was done with the other customer, Wilson had finished his food and got up to leave. "Wait," I said, but he didn't. He smiled from the door and said, "I hope I see you soon, but if not, I completely understand." Then he was gone. When I went to his table, I saw the giant tip he'd left behind. He also wrote a note for me on the check. "I'm so proud of you." After he left, it was just me and the other customer in the restaurant. He ate his food, politely ignoring my conversation with my dad. But he must have heard everything because he said, "I wouldn't trust him if I were you." "Why?" "It's none of my business, but I think he's scamming you." I really wanted him to be wrong, but it was logical to be suspicious. Ignoring my own feelings, if I had overheard the same conversation, I would have thought it was a scam too. But I still had to find out for myself, meaning I needed to go to that address. Otherwise, the uncertainty would eat away at me. "If you're still planning to see him again," the customer suggested, "don't go alone." "Sure," I agreed, though I was still going to go. The customer could tell that I wasn't convinced. "Let me go with you. Just in case." Even though we didn't really know each other, it was a nice offer. I thought about it for a bit, and I agreed. The customer introduced himself as Thomas, once he realized that I didn't remember his name. He finished eating, but didn't leave. I still had 2 more hours left in the night shift, but I didn't care. I locked the restaurant, hung up the close sign, and left with Thomas. Together, we drove to my dad's address. I felt very comfortable with Thomas. He seemed determined to make sure that I was safe. The address led us to a trailer park on the edge of town. It was a grimy, trash-filled area, a huge departure from the upper-middle-class neighborhood where I'd grown up. We double-checked that we were in the right place, and then I told Thomas to wait in the car while I went inside. "Good luck," he called out to me. I reached the trailer's front door and knocked. My father instantly greeted me with a hug. "I knew you'd come!" He excitedly pulled me inside and closed the door behind me. The trailer looked so much nicer on the inside. It was well decorated and colorful. Everything was clean. I thought about running outside to tell Thomas he could leave, but I figured that would be awkward in front of Wilson. He gave me a quick tour of the trailer, which was small but very comfortable. He took me to what I thought was the back door and said, "I have a guest bedroom built just for you. It's been sitting empty all these years. You'll always have a place to stay here." He sounded genuinely excited to show me the room. He even made me close my eyes before I walked in. He wanted me to be surprised. With my eyes closed, I walked into the room and immediately heard a slam behind me. The door was shut and locked behind me. I was trapped. This wasn't a bedroom at all. It was a kennel. There were dog cages lining the walls, each with a pillow and blanket inside. That man was not my father. He was a criminal or something. He'd lured me here by pretending to be my dad. And judging by the room, I wasn't his first victim. Who knew how many other times he had pulled the exact same scam, pretending to be some long-lost father? It was terrible. Outside the door, the man told me to pick a cage for myself and settle in. He asked if I heard him, but I didn't answer. He didn't say anything after that. For the next few minutes, I looked around the room, trying to find some way to escape. Then, the door creaked open. I expected to see my abductor on the other side, but it was Thomas. He was smiling, a single streak of blood across his cheek. Behind him My fake father was lying dead on the floor. He'd been bludgeoned. "Aren't you glad I came along?" Thomas asked. I wrapped him in a big hug. He'd just saved my life. We started dating after that, and we've been together ever since. The police connected my kidnapper, whose name really was Winslow, to at least a dozen other disappearances. But so far, none of the other women have been found. Oh, and I talked to my mom about my biological father. She insists he was just a one-night stand. I'm fine with that.
I came out to my parents last April and it did not go well. I thought they'd be chill about it. I was very wrong. I sat my parents down and told them that I was gay. My dad got really quiet and didn't say anything, but my mom completely flipped. She jumped off the couch and started screaming. I was so surprised by the whole thing that I don't even remember what she said. Except for the last part. She told me to get out. I couldn't believe it. Out of everybody, my mom had no right to kick out her only son. When she was my age, her parents kicked out her older brother, Dirk. It wasn't the same situation, of course. He'd gotten into some gang problems, and after he'd been arrested for shoplifting or something, my grandparents cut him off completely. Whenever my mom mentioned my Uncle Dirk, she always got really sad and said that she wished her parents had handled things differently. And now here she was, doing the exact same thing to her own child. It was really messed up. I was still in high school at the time, so I didn't have any money to get a place on my own, but I had plenty of friends that I could stay with. I very quickly gathered up all my stuff and left. I didn't even get to say goodbye to anyone. Once I'd gotten out of the house, I called my best friend Stacy to ask if I could crash at her place. I didn't even have to explain what happened. She could tell from my voice that I'd just been kicked out. Her parents liked me a lot, so there wasn't any problem with me spending the rest of the school year in their basement. After I moved in with Stacy, I didn't hear from either of my parents. The next few weeks were the worst weeks of my life. Stacy and her family were super supportive, but they were the only ones who knew that I'd been kicked out. I didn't tell any of my other friends in school. I think a couple of them knew that something was off, because it was hard for me to hide how depressed I was. But I didn't tell anyone the truth, and no one ever asked. Then one weekend, Stacy and her family decided to go visit her grandparents a few hours away. They invited me to go with them, but I didn't want to intrude. I already felt like I owed them so much. So they left on Friday night and let me spend the weekend by myself in their house. I read a little and watched some movies. Nothing too interesting. But then on Saturday night, I got a text. It was from my mom. She said, "Cody, I'm so sorry about everything. Please come home." I knew right away that something was off. My mom always used emojis when she texted. She abbreviated a lot of stuff too. This message didn't sound like her at all. I responded, "Who is this?" She responded, "It's your mom, sweetie. Come home." My mom never called me sweetie. This was obviously an imposter, but the messages were coming from her phone. I decided not to respond, but then a minute later she wrote, "Where are you? Why aren't you home right now?" A chill ran down my spine. "You know why I'm not there." She didn't respond for a while, and then she again asked me where I was. I figured she knew that I was staying at one of my friend's houses, but she didn't know which one. I wouldn't tell her anything. I was imagining the worst, that she'd hired some sort of counselor to come find me and scare me straight. Maybe that was the person texting me. I worried that if I told her where I was, she'd take me to a therapy camp or something. I decided the best thing to do was to just ignore any other messages she sent. She sent one more message demanding that I come home, and then nothing. I put my phone down and tried to forget about it, but I couldn't shake my uneasy feeling. After weeks of no contact, getting text messages that were clearly not written by my mom seemed very strange. I tried watching another movie, but I just couldn't concentrate. After a while, I turned off the TV and decided to walk to my house. I knew that was a stupid idea, but I figured that I could just hide in the bushes around my backyard and try to see if something was going on inside. No one would see me, and I'd be able to tell if there was some pastor or preacher or someone waiting for me to come back. I just needed to get some answers, so I pulled on my coat and walked down the street. My house was 3 blocks away, and as I walked there, I made sure to stick to the shadows. When I arrived, I snuck into the back and tried to look through the windows. Thankfully, the lights were on, so I could see clearly inside. I saw both my parents sitting on the sofa. It seemed normal, but as I looked closer, I saw that they were both tied up. And then a tall man walked into the room. He was covered in tattoos and carrying a gun. He was holding them hostage. It didn't take me long to realize that this was my long-lost Uncle Dirk. Despite years of hard living, his face was recognizable. He looked a bit like my mom. He shouted something at my parents, but I couldn't make out the words. I got closer to the window so I could hear. "Please," my mom said, "just take whatever you want and leave." "I don't want your stuff," my uncle screamed. "All I want is to destroy your perfect family. It's not fair that you have everything and I have nothing. Now tell me where your son is." He cocked the gun. This was insane. My uncle wanted to kill my entire family because he was jealous of us. If he only knew how imperfect we really were. I dug my phone out of my pocket and called 911. I told the policewoman my address and then hung up before my uncle could hear me through the window. But I was too late. I looked back into the living room and I saw my uncle's furious face staring at me through the glass. With one punch, he broke the window and grabbed me by the neck before I could move. I punched wildly, trying to get him off me, but he wouldn't let go. He pulled me through the broken window and into the house. He didn't realize that I grabbed a jagged piece of broken glass on the way, and once I was inside, I slashed at him. He dropped the gun and dove at me. I slashed at him again. "Don't hurt my family," I screamed. He threw me to the ground. The glass fell out of my hand. As he stood over me, he reached to the side and grabbed his gun. He kept repeating the same thing. "Perfect family, perfect family." I knew he was going to kill me. He was going to kill us all. But suddenly the front door burst open and 2 policemen rushed inside. They forced Uncle Dirk to drop his gun, and then they cuffed him and led him away. After a 3rd policeman untied my parents, my mom ran toward me and wrapped me in a big hug. "You're okay," she said. "You saved us." "Yeah, I could tell that the texts weren't coming from you, so I came over," I told her. "That was Uncle Dirk, huh?" "Yes," she said. "He just got released from jail. I had no idea he hated us so much." She hugged me tighter. I could tell she was crying. She apologized for kicking me out and begged me to forgive her. She wanted me to come back home. She said she accepted me the way I was. Dad was standing off to the side, still not saying anything, but he was smiling at me, waiting for my answer. "Thanks," I told them, "but I'm not ready to come back. I'm glad you're safe now, but you're going to have to earn my trust again." And I left. I went back to Stacy's house and went to bed. Since then, I've been talking to my parents more and more. I still haven't forgiven them for kicking me out. But I'm starting to. After all, they'll always be family.